Part 1, Ideal versus Reality. London, 1965. The clamor of carriages outside Parliament mingles with the rustle of freshly printed newspapers, all hailing the rise of a promising young politician. Jeremy Thorpe stands poised, the embodiment of charm, a sharp grey suit, a disarming smile, and a voice that commands attention with every word. To the public, he is the face of modern British politics, a beacon of progress and intellect in a country still clinging to its old traditions. But what seems perfect on the surface often conceals cracks beneath. Jeremy's marriage to Marion Thorpe is a key piece of his carefully curated image. Marion, elegant and well-spoken, is the ideal political wife. She attends charity functions, graces magazine covers, and speaks glowingly of her husband's vision for Britain. What she doesn't know, what no one must know, is the secret Jeremy has buried deep beneath his polished exterior. Years before his rise to prominence, Jeremy had shared an intense and forbidden relationship with Norman Joseph, a sensitive and spirited young man he met in the countryside. Back then, Jeremy's ambitions were no less fierce, but they hadn't yet been tempered by the ruthless demands of public life. His connection with Norman was genuine, a bond that offered him solace and freedom in a world that saw their love as a crime. However, the societal pressures were relentless. In the 1960s, homosexuality in Britain was not just taboo, it was illegal. For Jeremy, any whisper of his true self would be a death knell to his career. And so, he made the hardest decision of his life. He broke things off with Norman, erasing their time together in favor of a respectable future. Norman was devastated. The end of their relationship left him untethered, emotionally fractured, and nursing a growing bitterness. While Jeremy moved on to build a perfect public life with Marion, Norman was left in the shadows, drowning in the betrayal of being abandoned by the man he trusted most. As the years passed, Norman's pain simmered into resentment, and resentment grew into resolve. By 1965, he had become determined to confront Jeremy and demand acknowledgement, not just of their past, but of the pain Jeremy's choices had inflicted. For Norman, it was no longer just about their love, it was about reclaiming the part of himself that Jeremy had tried to bury. One rainy evening, Jeremy was alone in his office, preparing for an important speech. His phone rang, a rare, unfiltered call, bypassing his assistants. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, even after all these years. "Jeremy," Norman said, his tone steady but edged with pain. "We need to talk." Jeremy froze, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the receiver. Memories he'd tried to suppress surged to the surface, stolen moments in hidden gardens, whispered promises under moonlit skies, and the tearful goodbye that had shattered them both. "Norman," he replied carefully, his voice betraying none of the panic he felt. "This isn't a good time." "It never is it?" Norman's bitterness cut like glass. "I've stayed silent long enough. You can't keep running from this." The line went dead, leaving Jeremy staring into the emptiness of his office. The cracks in his carefully constructed world had begun to widen, and he knew one thing for certain: Norman wasn't going to let this go. As he sat there, the weight of his double life pressing down on him, Jeremy realized that his past was no longer content to remain buried. And with every step Norman took toward the truth, the specter of scandal loomed closer, threatening to destroy everything Jeremy had worked so hard to build. Part 2, The First Crack in the Facade. Winter, 1966. Jeremy Thorpe stared at the letter in his hands, the words scrawled across the page as though they were meant to cut. Norman Joseph's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, filled with the same intensity that Jeremy had once admired. But admiration had long since given way to dread. "Apologize," the letter demanded. "Acknowledge what we had, or I will ensure the truth comes out." Jeremy's breath was shallow as he folded the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. He had built his career on control, of his image, of his reputation, and of the secrets that could destroy both. Yet here it was, his past threatening to unearth itself in a string of letters that grew more pointed with every arrival. The first letter had arrived quietly, slipped into his desk among routine correspondence. It had seemed almost gentle, a plea from someone wounded. But as the weeks went by, Norman's tone shifted. The language became colder, the accusation sharper, and the demands more precise. Jeremy's attempts to silence the issue only made things worse. He instructed an intermediary, an old acquaintance from his legal days, to approach Norman with a gesture of goodwill. A sum of money, discreetly transferred, with the hope that it might buy Norman's silence. But Norman saw it for what it was, an insult, a bribe. The next letter made that clear. "Do you think you can pay me off?" it read. "You can't erase the truth with money." At home, the strain began to show. Marion noticed it first. Jeremy, usually composed and charismatic, had grown distant and irritable. His evenings were now spent locked in his study, his focus consumed by something he refused to share. Marion tried to dismiss it as the pressures of Parliament, but the unease gnawed at her. She had seen Jeremy under pressure before, this was different. "Jeremy," she asked one evening, as he sat at the dinner table, barely touching his food, "is something wrong?" He looked up sharply, his expression a mask of calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, nothing to worry about. Just the usual political chaos." But Marion wasn't convinced. She noticed how his gaze lingered on the letters that seemed to arrive more frequently now, how he flinched whenever the phone rang, as though expecting a voice he didn't want to hear. While Jeremy battled to keep his world from crumbling, Norman grew bolder. Frustrated by the lack of a direct response, he began reaching out to journalists. He painted himself as the discarded lover of a powerful man, weaving a story of betrayal, secrecy, and hypocrisy. The details were scant, he hinted at proof but revealed nothing concrete. Still, the intrigue was enough to catch the attention of certain reporters, those who thrived on the scent of scandal. One afternoon, Jeremy received a call from an anonymous journalist. The man's voice was calm, almost courteous, as he asked for a comment on allegations made by a Mr. Joseph. Jeremy's blood ran cold. He managed to deflect, claiming ignorance and insisting he had no knowledge of the matter. But as he hung up the phone, the panic that had simmered beneath the surface began to boil over. Sitting in his study that evening, Jeremy stared at the fireplace, the crackling flames doing little to calm his nerves. Norman wasn't bluffing. He was determined to drag Jeremy's secrets into the light, no matter the cost. And Jeremy knew that his carefully constructed life, his career, his marriage, his very identity, was balanced on the edge of a knife. Marion passed the doorway, pausing for a moment to glance inside. Jeremy sat stiffly, his silhouette stark against the firelight, the weight of his thoughts etched across his face. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped herself, retreating silently. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but Marion couldn't quite grasp what it was. For Jeremy, the realization was sinking in, the facade he had so meticulously maintained was beginning to crack. And no matter how hard he tried to patch it, the force pressing against it was relentless. Norman wasn't going away. And now, it wasn't just letters. It wasn't just threats. It was the first whispers of a scandal that could destroy everything. Part 3, The Explosion of Conflicts. Jeremy Thorpe sat in a smoke-filled drawing room, the weight of his unraveling world pressing down on him. Around him, a few trusted allies, fellow politicians, a party strategist, and his lawyer, exchanged tense glances. The stakes were clear to everyone present. If Norman Joseph's story reached the public, Jeremy's career would be over, and the fallout could drag the entire Liberal Party into the abyss. "This has gone too far," Jeremy said, his voice sharp but low. He held a glass of brandy in one hand, the other clenched into a fist. "We need to handle this, now." The room fell silent. No one dared to speak first. It was Lord Stanton, Jeremy's closest confidant, who finally broke the quiet. "We could arrange for a more aggressive approach," Stanton suggested, his words heavy with implication. "Find a way to ensure Joseph is unable to keep talking." The room seemed to hold its breath. Jeremy's gaze flickered toward Stanton, a mix of desperation and hesitation in his eyes. "What do you mean by aggressive?" he asked carefully. Stanton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We've dealt with loose ends before. A well-timed accident, perhaps. Something that ensures the problem disappears quietly and permanently. Jeremy didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, torn between the instinct to protect himself at all costs and the realization that crossing such a line could lead to even greater ruin. The measures leading to this grim conversation had already tested Jeremy's moral boundaries. Initially, he had hired private detectives to track Norman's movements, hoping to find leverage, something that could discredit him if his accusations reached the press. The detectives uncovered fragments of Norman's chaotic life, unpaid bills, transient housing, and troubled relationships. But none of it was enough to silence him. Desperate, Jeremy turned to less subtle methods. A series of anonymous letters arrived at Norman's temporary addresses, warning him to stop his crusade. The tone was menacing, but Norman, unshaken, continued to make calls to journalists, offering to sell his story to the highest bidder. Frustration mounting, Jeremy escalated further. Through intermediaries, he orchestrated a smear campaign, feeding salacious and exaggerated rumors about Norman's mental health and personal history to tabloid reporters. The idea was to paint him as a delusional, unstable individual whose claims could not be trusted. But Norman, with his determination sharpened by years of neglect and betrayal, refused to back down. The more Jeremy's desperation grew, the more his allies began to waver. In Westminster's shadowed halls, whispers of the scandal were beginning to spread. Jeremy's inner circle, once tight-knit and loyal, began to fracture under the pressure. "You're dragging us down with you," one senior party member hissed during a heated exchange in Jeremy's office. "If this gets out, it won't just be your career on the line, it'll be ours too. Do you think voters will trust us if we're seen as complicit in this mess?" "I've done everything for this party," Jeremy shot back, his voice trembling with anger. "You wouldn't be where you were if not for me. And now you want to abandon me?" "It's not about abandoning you," the man replied, though his tone was far from reassuring. "It's about survival. And right now, you're a liability." The words stung, but Jeremy knew they weren't entirely wrong. The scandal had become a storm cloud hanging over not just his career, but the party's future. As the weeks passed, more allies distanced themselves, their once friendly smiles now strained or absent altogether. Meanwhile, Norman's resolve only strengthened. Sensing that the media was beginning to take him seriously, he intensified his efforts. He provided journalists with scraps of evidence, letters from Jeremy, photographs that hinted at their time together, and detailed accounts of their relationship. Each piece was a potential bombshell, and Norman seemed intent on detonating them all. The tipping point came one fateful night when Jeremy received an urgent call from Stanton. "He's meeting with a reporter tomorrow," Stanton said. "He's planning to go public. We're out of time." Jeremy sat in silence, the weight of the situation crushing him. The strategies he'd used, bribes, threats, and manipulation, had all failed. Now, the conversation turned to the unthinkable. "Stanton's right," another ally chimed in. "If Joseph talks, it's over. There's no coming back from this." Jeremy stood abruptly, pacing the room as his mind churned through the possibilities. He couldn't afford to lose. He wouldn't lose. "Make the arrangements," he said finally, his voice cold and detached. "Whatever it takes. But do it discreetly." That night, as Jeremy sat alone in his study, the weight of his decisions bore down on him. The man he had been, the idealistic young politician who once believed in justice and integrity, seemed like a distant memory. In his place stood a man cornered by his own ambitions, willing to destroy lives to protect the facade he had built. But even as he convinced himself that he had no choice, a nagging fear lingered in the back of his mind. Had he already lost? Part 4, The Scandal Goes Public. The morning the headlines broke, London woke to shockwaves. Every major newspaper bore Jeremy Thorpe's name, splashed across their front pages alongside words like scandal, conspiracy, and betrayal. The reports were unrelenting, each more sensational than the last. Liberal MP in secret affair. Dark secrets of Jeremy Thorpe exposed. Conspiracy to silence, the fall of a rising star. Norman Joseph had finally acted. With a growing dossier of letters, photographs, and detailed accounts, he had handed over the story to an investigative journalist who had been circling the edges of the truth for months. Now, the dam had burst, and every sordid detail was spilling into public view. The evidence was damning. Norman had kept meticulous records of his correspondence with Jeremy, including the letters in which Jeremy had tried to pay him off. There were intimate details that no one else could know, enough to make denial impossible. And though the story itself was scandalous, it was the implication of a conspiracy to silence Norman that truly captured the public's attention. In Parliament, the atmosphere was electric. Jeremy's usual air of composure was gone, replaced by a visible tension that his colleagues could not ignore. The whispers in the corridors were louder now, and the once confident glances from his peers had turned into sidelong stares. "What's your plan, Jeremy?" a fellow MP asked him sharply during a tense meeting. Jeremy tried to feign control, but the words came out brittle. "This is all lies. A baseless attack from a man desperate for attention. I'll clear my name." But even as he spoke, Jeremy knew the truth. Clearing his name was a near impossible task. The story had already taken on a life of its own, and in the court of public opinion, he was guilty. The scandal quickly escalated to a full-blown legal crisis. Within days, Jeremy was formally accused of conspiracy to commit grievous harm, stemming from Norman's claims that he had been threatened and targeted for silencing. The accusations painted a grim picture, a politician so desperate to protect his secrets that he had orchestrated a plot to eliminate the man who could expose him. The courtroom was a spectacle. Photographers crowded the entrance, their flashes capturing Jeremy's every move as he entered, flanked by his legal team. Inside, the proceedings unfolded like a theatrical tragedy, with Norman taking the stand as the star witness. Norman's testimony was raw and unflinching. He spoke of their relationship, the promises Jeremy had made, and the betrayal he had felt when he was cast aside. He recounted the threats, the mysterious letters, and the shadowy figures who had trailed him. When asked why he had come forward, his voice was steady, his gaze fixed on Jeremy. "Because the truth matters," he said simply. Jeremy's defense was predictably firm: deny, deflect, and dismiss. His lawyers argued that Norman was a fantasist, a man whose erratic behavior and financial troubles made him an unreliable witness. They painted him as someone who had fabricated the entire story for attention and revenge. But the evidence was hard to refute, and Jeremy's polished facade began to crack under the weight of cross-examination. Outside the courtroom, the public response was unforgiving. In the conservative Britain of the 1960s, where homosexuality was still a criminal offense, the revelation of Jeremy's affair was more than just a personal scandal, it was a moral outrage. Editorials lambasted him for his hypocrisy, while public figures distanced themselves, eager to avoid association with the controversy. For Marion, the fallout was devastating. Reporters camped outside their home, their cameras and questions relentless. Friends who had once praised her for her poise now offered nothing but pitying looks. She had been the perfect political wife, but now her husband's disgrace had left her reputation in ruins. "Did you know?" they asked her repeatedly, their voices tinged with faux concern. "No," she would reply, her voice trembling but resolute. "I didn't know." But the truth, as always, was more complicated. Marion had suspected for months that something was wrong, but she had never imagined this. The man she had stood beside, the man she had trusted, had lied to her as much as he had lied to the world. As the weeks wore on, Jeremy found himself increasingly isolated. The Liberal Party, once his steadfast platform, began to edge away from him. Senior members held emergency meetings, debating whether to publicly denounce him to save the party's reputation. The whispers of betrayal grew louder, and Jeremy knew that his allies were turning into liabilities. On the streets, the public's condemnation was clear. Protesters gathered outside Parliament, their signs demanding his resignation. "Thorpe the hypocrite! No place for liars in Westminster." For a man who had built his career on charm and persuasion, the loss of public trust was a blow from which he could not recover. One rainy evening, as Jeremy sat alone in his once pristine study, the weight of the scandal bore down on him. His desk was piled high with letters, pleas from his legal team, demands for statements, and notes from the few allies who still stood by him. The room that had once been a place of ambition and strategy now felt like a prison. The scandal had started as a crack in the facade, but now it was an earthquake, tearing his life apart. Jeremy had always thought he could control the narrative, that his wit and intelligence could outmaneuver any obstacle. But Norman's determination and the weight of his own lies had proven too much. For the first time, Jeremy allowed himself to wonder, was this the end of everything? Part 5, The Price of Betrayal. The trial ended, but the consequences of the scandal were just beginning to unfold. Jeremy Thorpe, once the golden boy of British politics, now stood as a symbol of deceit and disgrace. The verdict itself was almost secondary. His reputation, carefully built over years, lay in ruins, trampled by the weight of public condemnation and personal failure. The voters, who had once seen Jeremy as a beacon of progress, turned their backs on him. His speeches, once met with thunderous applause, were now greeted by jeers and protests. Constituents who had admired his charm and intellect no longer wanted him as their representative. The party leadership, too, finally cast him aside, issuing a carefully worded statement distancing themselves from their fallen star. Jeremy had become a pariah in the very halls of Westminster he had once commanded with ease. Political allies who had stood by him for years now refused to return his calls. The whispers of betrayal he had begun to hear during the scandal had grown into full-throated denunciations. Jeremy's name was spoken only in hushed tones, as a cautionary tale of ambition turned to hubris. At home, the fallout was even more devastating. Marion Thorpe, the devoted wife who had stood by Jeremy through every public challenge, could no longer ignore the truth. She had endured the public scrutiny, the endless questions from journalists, and the shame of being pitted by those who once envied her position. But the final blow came when she uncovered the full extent of Jeremy's lies, not just about Norman, but about the lengths he had gone to conceal his secret. "I trusted you," she said one night, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "I gave up everything to support you, to help you build this life, and you've done nothing but deceive me." Jeremy, sitting on the edge of their bed, looked at her with hollow eyes. "Marion, I never meant for this to happen. I was trying to protect us, our life, our future." "Protect us?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You were protecting yourself. Don't pretend this was ever about me." Her decision was swift and irrevocable. Within days, she packed her things and left their home, her departure marked by the slamming of the front door that echoed through the now empty halls. For Jeremy, it was a silence far more painful than any public condemnation. Marion had been the one person who gave his life meaning outside of politics, and now she, too, was gone. Norman Joseph had fought to expose the truth, and in that, he had succeeded. His letters, his testimony, and his persistence had brought Jeremy Thorpe's duplicity to light. But the victory came at an immense personal cost. Norman became a household name, but not as a hero. Instead, he was vilified by much of the public, who saw him as the man who had destroyed a political career and sullied the image of British politics. The media that had once clamored for his story now turned on him, painting him as a troublemaker and opportunist. He struggled to find stability in the aftermath. Jobs were hard to come by, as employers were wary of hiring someone whose name had become synonymous with scandal. In public, he was often recognized and met with sneers or outright hostility. The same society that had applauded his courage in the courtroom now shunned him for daring to speak out. Even in his private moments, Norman was haunted by the life he had lost. He had once loved Jeremy deeply, believing in their bond even when the world condemned it. But that love had turned into a bitter struggle for acknowledgement, and though he had won, it felt hollow. His victory had left him alone, a man who had burned every bridge in the process of fighting for his truth. In the months that followed, Jeremy Thorpe faded from the public eye. His career was over, his marriage was in shambles, and his name had become a stain on British politics. He retreated to a small country home, far from the limelight he had once craved, where he lived in a kind of self-imposed exile. The letters, the speeches, the promises of a brighter future, all of it seemed like the relics of another life, one that no longer belonged to him. For Marion, the journey away from Jeremy was both painful and liberating. She rebuilt her life piece by piece, reclaiming the independence she had sacrificed for her marriage. In time, she found solace in her own strength, though the scars of betrayal never fully faded. Norman, too, continued to struggle, but there were moments of quiet vindication, small reminders that, despite everything, he had spoken the truth. But the question lingered for all of them: was it worth it? The price of betrayal, of secrets kept and truths uncovered, had left everyone shattered in its wake. And as the years passed, the memory of the scandal lingered like a shadow, a reminder of what happens when ambition, love, and lies collide. Part 6: Moral Defeat. Jeremy Thorpe sat in the back corner of a small, dimly lit hall, staring out at the sparse crowd gathered for what was likely to be his final public address. The grand stages of Westminster were long behind him. Now, his audience was made up of curious onlookers, a handful of sympathizers, and a smattering of journalists eager to catch one last twist in the tragedy of his life. The speech had been Jeremy's idea, a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of dignity. His legal team had advised against it, but he was determined. This was his last chance to rewrite the narrative, to remind the world of the man he once was, or at least the man he wanted them to believe he had been. He took the podium, his once commanding presence diminished by years of scandal and disgrace. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of desperation as he began to speak. "I stand before you not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one hoping for understanding," he said, his words rehearsed yet hollow. "I have made mistakes, grave mistakes, but my intentions were never malicious. I sought only to protect those I cared about, to preserve what I believed was right." The crowd listened, but the energy in the room was cold. The public's patience had long since worn thin, and Jeremy's attempt at redemption was met with skepticism, even derision. From the back, a reporter called out, "Protect who, Mr. Thorpe? Yourself?" The words cut through the air, and Jeremy faltered, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time. He opened his mouth to respond but found he had no answer. The silence was deafening. The days following the speech were a mirror of the rest of Jeremy's fall, a wave of condemnation and ridicule that further eroded whatever scraps of his reputation remained. Newspapers picked apart his words, calling them self-serving and insincere. Political commentators declared the speech a failed attempt to rewrite history, a desperate plea from a man who refused to take full responsibility for his actions. The backlash left Jeremy more isolated than ever. Allies had long since abandoned him, and even the few friends who had stayed in contact began to slip away, their sympathy worn thin. In the solitude of his country home, Jeremy finally began to confront the reality he had avoided for so long. Days turned into weeks as he wandered through the empty halls, his only companions the memories of a life that now felt like someone else's. He thought of Marion and the way she had looked at him the night she left, hurt, betrayed, and yet oddly resolute. He thought of Norman, the young man he had once loved, whose life he had irrevocably altered in his attempt to save himself. And he thought of his younger self, the ambitious politician who had believed he could have it all: power, respectability, and secrecy. In the quiet, Jeremy began to see the truth. His life had not been destroyed by Norman's actions or by the public's judgment. It had been destroyed by his own choices, his greed for power, his fear of being himself, and his relentless need to control the narrative at all costs. He had betrayed everyone who had mattered to him: Norman, Marion, his friends, his party, and even himself. Every lie he had told, every decision he had made to protect his image, had been another crack in the foundation of his life. And now, with nothing left, he was finally forced to see the ruin he had created. As Jeremy sat by the window one gray afternoon, watching the rain streak down the glass, he scribbled in a notebook, something he hadn't done in years. He wrote not to justify his actions, but to understand them. "I wanted to be great," he wrote, the words jagged and uneven. "But greatness built on lies is nothing more than a shadow. I feared the truth because I thought it would destroy me. In the end, it was the lies that did." Norman Joseph, meanwhile, had moved on as best he could. Though his life had been marred by the scandal, he found a kind of peace in knowing that he had spoken the truth. The cost had been high, but he had no regrets. Marion, too, found strength in her new life. Away from Jeremy, she rediscovered her independence and built a life unburdened by his lies. The betrayal had left its mark, but she refused to let it define her. The story of Jeremy Thorpe became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how ambition and fear can destroy even the most promising of lives. In the end, it wasn't just Jeremy who paid the price for his deceit, it was everyone around him. And as the years passed, Jeremy faded into obscurity, a man who had once sought greatness but had been undone by his own choices. His final lesson, though learned too late, was one the world would not forget, that lies, no matter how carefully crafted, will always come at a cost. Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.